Good morning, good morning. My goodness, there is standing room only. This is excellent. Yeah, we are going to get started. So thanks, everybody, for coming. There are probably a handful of seats. No, they're not. You're just all going to have to stand. Good morning. So you're all here for financial advice? No. All right, so good. You've come to the right place. So I'm Eric Porras, Chief Marketing Officer for Rocket Fuel. My esteemed panel is to my stage left. I'd like to just introduce yourself and tell the audience one thing that they would not know about you from your LinkedIn profile.
My name is Brian D'Alessandro. I'm VP of Data Science at MITX Degrees. I essentially lead the R&D for all the algorithms. One thing that my LinkedIn profile doesn't state is I'm a musician and I'm a full-time member of a rock band in Brooklyn. So I might actually put that on there soon, but I'll have to come up with a new point.
I'm Leon Barsumian. I am the VP Group Director of Analytics for Havas Media, so I run the analytics group for the Boston office. One thing I believe it's not on my LinkedIn profile is out of college I started a nonprofit.
Paying off student debt? No, what was that?
Well, kind of, actually. It's actually a scholarship foundation. So we look at applicants and we determine who to give scholarships to and provide mentorship for.
Very cool.
So Jay Heiberger, I'm CEO and founder of OwnerIQ, and there are many things that are not on my LinkedIn profile, but one of them that people find the strangest is that I'm an internet CEO with Amish blood in me.
All right, so we will do this. Next year, this will be in the Shenandoah Valley. So it was interesting. So I got to meet the CMO of Fidelity not too long ago. So thank you, Fidelity, for providing us the space. And it was at a conference at Wharton about the future of advertising. And CEO said, or CMO rather said, it was Jim Spiros, and he said, data, data everywhere, not a drop of insight. So we're hoping that by the end of this panel, at least, you go from maybe data to insight and from insight to wisdom. It looks like based on the badges here, everybody is more or less somewhat familiar with this space. So we're going to get right into it. I'm going to ask Leon first. In the data space, in this ad tech ecosystem, we often talk about there's premium inventory, there's remnant inventory. Can the same thing be said about data? What do you define as premium data versus quote-unquote remnant data?
So there is remnant data. That's the quick answer. So premium data would be first-party data that's actually very qualified and accurate. To define remnant data is actually a tougher challenge, and it's really a function of the industry that we live in. We have a couple of kind of headwinds. One is, believe it or not, most of the data is actually not purchased by advertisers or agencies. It's mostly purchased by publishers and third parties, and they're actually bundled together. And so it doesn't provide the analytics folks on the agency side a lot of transparency around what is the data that's being actually leveraged, what's actually working and what's not. So that's one of the headwinds. And then two, it's about also defining quality, right? There is no standard definition of quality in the space, and at least different standards. And what I mean by standards is what defines sellable data, right? What does data have to be sellable, right? And so an example would be it has to be fresh data, right? It can't be old data that might be just obsolete and not correct. So those two headwinds are a challenge in the marketplace for us to find and define remnant data.
Well, I think this is a good segue to a question I wanted to ask Brian, which is, can you give the audience an example, so we're not talking about platitudes here, but hopefully talking about something real, how one of your clients gave you a piece of previously inaccessible data and how it affected the results of a marketing program? So Leon just brought it up, right? So what is premium data? Premium data could be CRM data, could be customer data. So help the audience understand how that actually manifests itself and drives results.
So I definitely agree with Leon's points. First-party data is some of the best data you can get your hands on. And generally that represents strong purchase intent, brand awareness, et cetera. These are all the things that you're really after when you're doing data analytics. On that note, something that's starting to be more available, and this is usually done via demand management platforms such as BlueKai, is CRM data. So a lot of the predictive modeling online is done via the retargeting pixel. Brand like Fidelity might retarget their page, and you know who's been to Fidelity, who hasn't been to Fidelity. From that, you could start doing all sorts of optimization. But for a lot of campaigns, a lot of brands, particularly big ones that might have a very homogeneous customer base. What they're really after are the premium customers customers in a particular segment. So one case that worked for us is we were running the campaigns for a large telecom provider, and we were doing their basic mobile and home business. They came to us looking to reach small businesses and sell their small business product. The first test we did with them using just their kind of generic homepage data didn't perform so well. So then at the same time they were integrating with BlueKai, and we were after the integration they were able to send to us small business. So which of their customers were actually the small businesses buying their premium small business products. After that integration, we're able to do essentially Media 6 Degrees. It's like a lookalike or an act-alike style of predictive modeling. We're able to do the lookalikes off of the small business customers. And after that point, after the campaign kind of steadied out, we were hitting their goal 30% below what their cost per acquisition goal was. So that was something that could have only been done with access to the premium data within the client.
Cool. Well, you brought up a good point in terms of predictive, and I know OwnerIQ talks about this a lot, or at least a lot in your marketing material. And we'll see if Jay actually
we do it a lot.
brings it home. So in the world of targeting, and Brian brought it up, I think we're still in the early days of moving from a planning construct from prescriptive targeting to predictive targeting. Right? We've talked about prescriptive. Okay, I've got a segment. I want men, 18 to 34, club-footed home office radiologists, whatever the prescription might be. But let's talk about predictive, and actually let's talk about the challenges you face in terms of changing the mindset of a potential customer. That customer could be an agency or an advertiser, in terms of getting around this notion of, well, I've historically planned all my communications planning has been based on these very broad segments. How do you move them past that mentality?
Yeah, it really is a challenge these days. I mean, you think about prior to a lot of the resources that we have today, the dimensions that you would think about your customer and your targeting would be fairly limited. And so you would define these broad categories, or you would say, this is my very specific customer. And we've had plenty of examples where we go in and we're working with clients. One in particular that we always talk about in the office is we bring brands to market like Peapod and Fresh Direct and use the audiences and their data. And we had a cheese manufacturer that was very interested in conquesting people that were buying other brands of cheese. So the only data they were interested in is people that were demonstrably shopping for cheese at Peapod or a Fresh Direct kind of client, which, as you imagine, is a pretty small target. And it took a lot to move them off of that. Well, anybody actually in the grocery or in market there is, frankly, potentially a cheese intender, shall we say. And how do we actually find that audience that looks like that? And predictive has been the mechanism by which we've used all these brand and product signals to triangulate in on a marketing outcome. But oftentimes, we actually will run things in parallel on an insertion order from a client, which will be what we call advertiser directed, which is their vision of who they want to go after, and then we run a predictive line, which is effectively looking across a sort of set of signals that we think might be indicative, and let our software essentially figure out which is the right prospect and which delivers the goods. And typically, it is the predictive line that delivers more of the performance than the advertiser-directed line.
An interesting follow-up question on that, and then back to Leon. So you mentioned prescriptive, you mentioned predictive, you mentioned taking lots of signals. Brian also talked about a little bit in terms of whether it be a lookalike or an act-alike or take a lookalike, whatever you want to call it. In your experience, Leon, because you get it from both sides, right? You're at Havas, you have a trading system, you also hear from companies like all of us, for example, talking about the volume of data points, right? So we talk about big data, you talk about volume, velocity, variety, veracity, et cetera, all your 4 or 5 V's of big data. Does volume matter? Or when a solution, it could be any one of us, for example, or your own trading desk comes and says, hey, I've got 40,000 data points, I've got 50,000 data points, I can examine them in a millisecond. Do you care?
No. And the reason is it's table stakes, right, to be able to process 50,000 or 100,000 data points per second. To me, what's more important is to actually tell the story and come partner with us to tell us a story about what data should be used and why. Bring in historical kind of results in terms of, these data points we know are actually going to drive your business in your kind of category. And these are the things that we're going to go into market with and how we're going to test it. To us, really, it's not about the numbers. It's about the quality. It's about telling the stories. And to your point, every day people come in kind of pitching their wares about what they can do, what they can't do, but they never kind of tie the story together of telling us exactly what they're planning on doing, how they're planning on doing it, and why they're planning on doing that particular thing.
Of course, I'd say the flip side of that, though, now we'll get to the controversy stage. So if there are any free chairs here, this will be like the Ricky Lake show. That sounds a little bit, though, like we're moving back away from the model of predictive to one that's prescriptive. So that to me, at least it sounds like it, and you can help us understand your differential.
Well, it's not the same, actually. I think you have to start somewhere, right? And that's what we're looking for. We need people to come in and tell us where to start based off of historical data, right? Like, I don't want to start optimizing 2, 3, 4 weeks in market. I want to kind of go in pretty pre-optimized, and then, of course, we start to become a little bit more predictable and learn from there.
Seed data. Okay, so
Exactly.
fair to say that you're trying to figure out what's the right seed that any company here, your own desk, what have you, could plant to see if that garden will grow.
To get in on this and promote some of the controversy, though, the 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 is kind of silly, and I don't think as an industry we've done a great job of explaining why any of that matters. There is no difference between 40, 50, 60. That's immaterial. But what is different and what is really a sea change in how we think about the problem is the fact that the software can do it better than you can. And starting from a seed data, oftentimes we see that isn't even the right solution, which is to say, open it wide up, and I know your company, Rocket Fuel, does this as well. Open it wide up. The software will make decisions faster and better than any human is going to do. Use all the signals that you can possibly get, and let it triangulate into the right outcome, whatever that market or outcome is. And that is a real, it continues to be a real challenge in terms of talking to advertisers about that is the way of looking at the problem, rather than speccing out very narrow targeting segments and saying, I really do know. Well, usually we find the machine actually knows better.
Well, and so then just a related question on that, though, which is, and you can address this, because originally this was going to be a Jay question, but now this will be a Leon question. DMPs, right? So you just brought up a point of, in a world filled with algorithms and machine learning, what role today does a data management platform play when if it requires human manipulation to pull levers and create segments to make them actionable, when you may have 100,000 computers across 15 data centers being able to make those hypotheses much faster than necessarily the human input might drive it.
So is the question?
So the question is role of DMP in world of the agency. Is it a repository? Is it a place to store data? Or is it a place to make data actionable? And if it is a way to make data actionable, where do you get started when you think about it?
So it's got to be the latter, right? It's got to be something that we can actually take action on. I think the bigger question is, where does the data lie and who should own the data, right? And so for us, like, if I was to say, most serious advertisers, right, come in with an agency, looking at the long-term relationship, right? And so there's this kind of agreement that we're all in it for the long term. There are agreements around privacy and data and whatnot. So the agency technically has the best interest at heart of the advertiser, right? And so when we look at data, we believe that we should own as much of the data as possible, or have access to the data as much as possible to inform marketing decisions. So that's kind of the short answer to it. But in terms of kind of just responding to Jay's comment about predictive, sure, machines are obviously going to outpace humans, and we need that, but we also need humans, right? It's the machines are developed by humans. The algorithms are refined by humans. Theories and tests are structured by humans a lot of times, right, fundamentally. And so we need that nice balance of having the curious human to touch and say, okay, here are the different things that I'm seeing in terms of the data. I wonder if I moved a few things around, if it'd give us different conclusions. And so that's kind of why I was like, we can't just kind of throw it all into this machine to go and buy all the media for me and cross my fingers that everything is going to work.
The way I see that last point is that humans are necessary to ask the right questions, but machines are necessary to give unbiased answers. And which kind of goes to the prescriptive versus the predictive. The machine will tell you exactly what are the data points that correlate with the outcome that are looking. What is actually predictive versus the human bias saying, my intuition tells me that this particular segment is going to be the best one, and let's only go for that one. So we need both in this world. You can't just rely on the machine and have no people controlling it. And if it's just people, then it'll never scale.
But okay, so good question, or a good segue, Brian, to talk about data recency and decay. As a data science wizard such that you are, when is data no longer helpful to make intelligent purchasing and optimization decisions? And in your experience, what kind of data decays first?
So multiple ways to answer this. The first thing is I think recency absolutely matters, but it's all dependent. So I'm the guy who says on one hand X, Y, Z, on the other hand, A, B, C. When it comes to asking if data is appropriate or if there's 50,000 or one variable is appropriate, it really comes down to, is it the right data? And the right data can mean many things. 50,000 of the right data points is better than one of the right data point, but 50,000 wrong data points is worse than one of the right data point. And when it comes to recency is generally recent data is what I would consider the right data. But it really, again, it depends. If someone told you a data segment that indicated gender, chances are gender doesn't change that often. So it's, if the segment was reliable 6 months ago, it probably is reliable today. But if you're looking at some sort of intent data, an auto intent or a travel intender, well, if that person was intending to go on vacation 6 months ago, they probably did. And now they're not going to do it for another year or two. So you need something that's fresher. So I guess to generalize that, if it's something that is very timely, like an intent sort of purchase, you want as recent as possible. If it's something that is like a static quality of a person, which generally those aren't even as predictive anyways, you might want to target females, but that doesn't necessarily predict that much. So the more useful data tends to need to have some recency component to it, absolutely.
Eric, are you talking about cookie decay as well, or are you just looking at?
Well, and it's cookie decay can be tied into it.
Yeah. So we look at recency in two different ways. There's the intrinsic cookie decay from when you've acquired a signal. How long were you actually going to hold on to that signal, regardless of whether it may be useful or not? But how long are you going to hold on to it? And then there is the question of the problem you're trying to solve. How recent does that data need to be for the problem you're trying to solve? So in the cookie decay, we're really now working on effectively a 30-day decay window, meaning that as from our perspective, you have to turn over your cookie pool every 30 days. Now, the distribution tends to be highly bifurcated between those that keep their cookies forever and those that delete them right away, but for planning purposes, we use a 30-day window. In terms of recency, if it's retargeting and you're trying to work with the attribution models that are typically given to us by our agency clients, seconds matter. Age in seconds really does matter. If you're trying to drive an outcome for, say, an appliance dealer in northern New Jersey, the fact that somebody was on like a brand like Miele 2 weeks ago is still highly relevant and useful for optimizing for that client.
So, go ahead.
There's always cases where the flip side is true. A particular product that if someone purchased something yesterday, you probably don't want to target them for a while. But if you know that they purchased 6 months ago, they're a good candidate because it might be a pair of shoes where there's a natural cycle. So you have to kind of approach these questions by looking at the data and attaching the right question to it and then kind of letting the analytics give you some insight into what is the right answer.
So speaking of asking for the right data potentially, and this question opened up for anybody, is what data in your opinion or in your experience is off limits for targeting? What data can't we use? Or what data, or in your data wish list, I really wish I could have this data, but it's not accessible to me yet. Either what's missing from the pie or what should we take away from the pie?
I'll take a little bit of the first one in terms of what's off limits, because what we do is we help brands bring their audiences to market, so we have some interesting situations. So for example, some of our local clients are like CVS and Wayfair. In the case of CVS, they are subject to HIPAA regulations with regard to all the pharmacy information. So there's an example where that data is not only off limits to us, we don't even, we consciously don't have access to any of the online pharmacy data. We also work with companies like Toys R Us, which are subject to, or are trying to make sure they stay COPA compliant, which is Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, so we have requirements there. But the biggest thing that we deal with every day is because we're bringing brand audiences to market, those brands wouldn't do it if they thought by working with us they were just going to make their audience available for conquesting. So for example, if Staples thought by working with us, Office Max or Office Depot were going to be able to then conquest Staples customers, they would never do it. And that's a question that we get with every brand that we work with. So from our perspective, we always have to manage that cross cross-targeting to make sure that it doesn't happen, and that we have institutional barriers to prevent brands that we work with, like Samsung conquesting LG or LG conquesting Samsung. That's typically the most frequent kind of constraint that we're dealing with to make sure that we're not commingling data that we shouldn't.
Brian, how about you? So we talked a little bit before the panel about 5 years ago, a lot of this data didn't exist. Is there something that you're looking at or thinking about in terms of the time horizon of, I really wish I had location data, or I really wish I had registry data? Like, what is there enough data out there for this entire ecosystem to thrive, or are we still looking for more?
The data that's a lot more accessible now that wasn't accessible is kind of very granular action data. For instance, you can, just by looking at the RTB stream, the bid request essentially, you know which websites people are going to. And there's a lot of useful predictive information coming out of that. And I completely agree with Jay that the medical data is just kind of off limits. You don't even think about it, as well as kind of maintaining that covenant with your advertisers that you're not going to cross each other's data streams. And that's something that every firm should probably hold dear. But I think location is going to be interesting. It kind of goes into this idea of very granular action data, which is something that I've seen in all my years of doing modeling to be predictive. But in general, I think something like any sort of purchase data. If you had access to eBay or the Amazon stream, that would be pretty amazing. Where you can basically see every product that someone is buying. That's where the predictive juice is. So it's just how do we get there?
Mm-hmm. Although I wonder, but in the case of Amazon, yeah, and of course Amazon's doing a great job of this. Think about the filter bubble, right? So if I only have this one set of data, like, oh my God, I have this really one amazing set of data, are you taking that at the expense of not looking at other segments or other pieces of data? And can you combine them together? But related question, which is, how do businesses operate in a post-do not track world? So we just talked about some data that you have to keep separate. Well, what if you didn't have that data at all? Like, how does the model change? Targeting models, predictive models change in a world where DNT is, well, it's been on the horizon for 4 years, so it still hasn't actually come yet. And then one of the people that's on part of the commission has just resigned this morning. And it's 4 years in the making for do not track, so we're not there yet. But the conversation still exists. So if we existed in a do not track world, what would change?
I think there will always be data. When the way a lot of the predictions work is a bid request comes in, and there's data associated with that bid request, like who the user is, what's the IP address, what website they're on. So those things will exist without cookies. So there's certainly targeting can still happen. I think the biggest challenge is going to be performance and basically how do you attribute conversions and know if conversions even happen. So this becomes not just a problem for the targeting firms like MITX Degrees, but the agencies and the brands as well we're all going to sit there scratching our head trying to come up with a new way to track effectiveness. And I
hope the folks from Visual IQ just didn't have a heart attack here, but we'll talk about them for separate conversation. Because attribution becomes a really big problem. You're right. Mm-hmm.
So when we look at the data that we use to make decisions, it really divides into a number of different camps. There's what we call the contextual data, which is the information about the page that the user's on. There's what we call the opportunity data, which is specifically about the ad placement that we have the opportunity to bid on and decide whether we want to purchase. There's the temporal data, what's the time, day a week, hour a day, things like that. And then finally, there's the user data. So what we're really talking about is dispensing with that last category, which is the user data. And that would be unfortunate. We do have an example of that marketplace largely today, which is the mobile industry. Which really doesn't have this notion of this kind of user profile. They do have device ID and things like that you can use to do it. They do have ideas around fingerprinting, so you can use to do it, all of which undoubtedly would be ported back into the online world, and you would start trying to use those techniques to piece things back together. But if you see what's happening in mobile, independent of that, it's inefficient targeting, low CPMs, lots of raw tonnage. I'm not sure that's really an environment that as advertisers we're all particularly thrilled about, but that in fact would be the outcome.
Right, just to add to that, so the example of mobile is great because that's not going to be acceptable, right, in a desktop space where there is no data to inform some of your targeting. So my guess would be is that the browser is going to play a bigger role, where they're the ones who are actually going to have to pump some data back into the systems around the user flow, the user information, anything. And so I think that's going to be, and that's actually possibly going to be even more accurate than the cookie system that we have.
So I'm going to ask more questions, and maybe we have time for 2 more questions because we started a little bit late. Leon, from the agency perspective, we talked about proxies. We talked about lots of different data types. We're in a great city that thrives on young people coming into this space. You sit them down at your desk. It's day 1 of ad tech ecosystem training. How do they start? How do you start thinking about, how do we as an industry start thinking about training the next generation of people who then sit on panels in terms of how they should think about data? Where do they get started? Should they start with weather data? Should they start with contextual data? Should they start with user data? What's the way to enlighten the next generation of folks to what's happening and where the system is going?
So I think the first thing, like I mentioned earlier, it's about clarity, right, about what you're buying and what data layers you're buying. You start there. And 2 is essentially just setting up a structured test, right? You're putting one data layer in, you see how that goes, the second one, a third one, you kind of incrementally add to your test models to understand, what variables are actually driving the KPI that you've chosen. I think it's as simple as that. I think a lot of people don't do enough of that, where they kind of sit back and kind of think back of like what is the objective? What are our initial guts of like what's worked for us in the past in terms of those data layers? Is it demos? Is it contextual? Is it whatever? And we can start with those, right? The historical winners, and then just kind of grow upon that because, again, it's like there's too much data in the marketplace. People are jamming it into the system, and we can't see actually what's working. It's because of what? Like, why did that work? Is it the algorithm? Is it because the data that they use is rich? Is it because they were at the right place at the right time? Why was it? Was it because there was, the competitive spend decreased? We don't know. And so we need to kind of provide a little bit more of the transparency around what's in the system in order to come to conclusions.
So data scientists, fresh out of school, where do you start training them? We talk about training models. You talk about predictive models. Where are they going to find the best value?
My opinion of data science is it's a very experiential and hands-on sort of role, and I almost think of it as there needs to be like an apprenticeship program. Just because you have your master's or your PhD doesn't mean you're going to sit down and have. It's not even about the technical knowledge because you'll get that in school. It's about just kind of understanding generally what works. There is no, of all the textbooks that tell you how to do data science, there's none that will tell you how on day 1 to optimize a campaign. Right, so you really need hands-on training. Larger than just the data scientist role, though, is, and I think this is an important skill that all young people should have getting into advertising, is just basic knowledge of an A/B test, how to run one, why do they work, and how to evaluate it. You might not care about the statistics that go into determining like confidence intervals, but at least if someone tells you, confidence interval of 95%, you understand what that means, because as Leon mentioned, experimentation is kind of the necessary tool for answering any question in the world, in the advertising world that we're living in, and everybody needs to be fluent in the methodology and the terminology behind it. And so whether you're just the CMO or the data scientist, it doesn't matter. It's an important skill to have.
Jay?
Well, there's actually 2 embedded questions there. It's kind of how do you build a culture that is based on sort of looking at data and driving decisions, and the second one is sort of as campaign optimization, where do you start? I'm actually going to address the first one because it's been the thing that has occupied a lot of my attention, which is trying to build a culture that actually looks at data and starts from with every question is what information do we have to bring to bear at this problem. And we've taken a perspective of what I call quantitative common sense, which is rather than populating the organization with PhDs, trying to inculcate a sense of just all the math you learned in junior high and high school, it actually matters. And if you can use that and start there, you can actually do pretty well. Things like just understanding how to build an index, which turns out is a surprisingly rare skill in terms of trying to look at how a signal differs from the background and trying to push that throughout the organization. So we've done things like having analytics meetings religiously every week where everybody involved comes and has almost trying to run it like a seminar where people come with things that they've been working on, and they present them for peer review, furthering the idea of developing a hypothesis, developing a model, having that peer reviewed and tested. When you develop software, testing it for software correctness before you even look at business outcomes and things like that. It has been a long process. I mean, a multi-year process, and I know as an organization we're not fully there yet. The core parts that we need to be are, but the rest of the organization is still kind of coming along. It is difficult to do, and I would say, in any organization that wants to start using all of these techniques, that to me has been what I observe is one of the fundamental obstacles, which is getting staff that's able to work not at the PhD or master's level, but just work at the numerical competence level consistently.
So you can be an English major to be a storyteller, but don't forget your junior high school math. All right, excellent. So we have time for one. We started late, but we still want to end on time. We have time for one question. Is there one really? Okay, we may have time for three. Three really, really, really smart questions. Really smart questions from the audience. You've all thought you were here, in fact, for advice about financial services, so we're sorry. Question from the front. Natasha.
When we were talking about the cookie window, and you were saying 30 days.
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, so talking about the cookie window, and you mentioned 30 days, but what if it's a B2B enterprise product that the sales cycle is 9 to 12 months? Would you still do 30 days, or should it be longer?
Well, when it comes to the cookie window, my opinion is it's not whether it should be longer or not because your sales cycle is longer. It's just, in fact, unfortunately, you're dealing with an intrinsic fact of life nowadays, which is that B2B customer that you may be trying to reach may be accessing you from multiple devices. Their IT department may have configured security software that automatically deletes their cookies. All of those things that are independent of the sales cycle you're trying to manage to, but are just intrinsic features or defects of the environment that you're working in. So yeah, unfortunately, you still have to recognize that your B2B sales cycle that takes 9 months, you have a 30-day cookie window approximately from the time that somebody visits your site.
I don't need that. I can project.
And Kane from Havas.
I work with Leon, and I noticed that the question was directed at Leon regarding what is the agency's value in a DMP world and an algo-based world, right? Do people add value? So obviously, I think they do. But I asked you back, right? Like, what do you see as the human role in an algo-based big data world? Like, where do you see people adding value when you're opening up the floodgates and letting computers make decisions for you?
Do you want me to go ahead and take that? I'm happy to.
I mean, I can give you a 15-second response from my perspective, and I mentioned it toward the end, which is humans are great at storytelling. Humans are great. Imagine the power that you had. So if you think about our space, hey, you're great, you're young, a young person in advertising, you come into advertising, and you get dumb spreadsheets. You're like, oh, how mundane is that? Is that really necessary? And so I think about it from the perspective of strategy, not spreadsheets. And at least for the moment and for this moment in time, narrative science hasn't quite gotten to the place where they can replace humans in terms of storytelling. So I think asking the right questions. Everybody here said, how do you ask the right questions? Humans are best equipped to be curious and to ask the right questions. It's the machines that I think that are going to be the ones that are able to make hypotheses actually actionable in a much faster way than they were before. So I'd like to think that humans as storytellers, as content creators, as ideators, machines are not necessarily ideators in that capacity. So I think there's a wonderful role for the agency still to play. I do think, from my perspective, the role of buying teams and optimization teams, I think that energy could be potentially better spent elsewhere.
I have more to add to that. I think one of the best qualities of a data scientist or anybody who's working in the analytic area is skepticism. Unfortunately, the agencies are often the most skeptical, at least when we approach them. And
healthy skepticism. Healthy.
Yeah, it's the reason is that a machine or a computer will always give you an answer. As long as the code is written without bugs, a number will pop out of that machine. The question is, can you just look at it and say, is that the right number? And the machine won't do that. It'll just give you the number. And I think without people, you won't be able to progress past the output of the machine. And skepticism is usually where that goes, because there's plenty of times where I've built a model and the results were amazing, and I opened a bottle of champagne, and then I just checked it again and I realized I made a mistake. And you're like crap. So, you know, it's important to just evaluate your own work. You know, I do that all the time, and also when people make claims, even if there's data behind it, to be skeptical. You know, prove it, like really prove it to me that what you're saying is true.
Jason,
All right, we have time.
when do I get my money back? I mean,
One hand up over there.
can you use range?
And hey, a microphone that works. We think.
You talked a lot about, obviously collecting the data and how you're applying it, but in terms of monetizing and putting a dollar amount against it, when you're learning all these things, how are you justifying to your clients, saying, all right, we're gaining all these great insights? Where's the dollar amount come from in terms of their ROI and justifying a spend on pure analytics?
In a direct response driven world, it's a very simple question. You spend $100, do you get 110 back? Going beyond that is more difficult naturally, particularly as you get more upper funnel and like branding type stuff. Kind of where you started going with your question, and I think is a very important question, is what is the value of data? I think that that along with attribution is probably one of the most difficult questions to solve in this space, and I don't know if there is one answer, and I think every firm will have different approaches to it, but there generally is no one answer, and which kind of makes it always difficult to really put your finger behind it.
Well, I think there's also a difference too between value creation and cost efficiency. So if you're always thinking about cost efficiency, then you're actually narrowing your scope. If you're thinking about value creation, what can those analytics apply to other forms of media? We see it with clients of ours. I'm sure everyone here has examples of stories where digital insight, you have this great learning lab, which is the entirety of the web. How do those insights truly become wisdom to say, you know what, maybe I should actually adjust maybe I should kill print. Maybe I should change TV. Maybe I should change my radio frequency in a particular geography because I have this great location data that I didn't have before. So I think we all should be thinking at the same time, even though, yes, a lot of the budget going into digital is about direct response spend, get a dollar, get $1.10 back. If we think about the question of value creation, I think we're all in the right business. We're all in the right business if we're able to create value and think about it that way. So with that, I want to thank my panelists. I want to thank this rapt audience. You've been great. Thank you very much.